Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you at the C20 Summit and at this plenary session on the argument for development in the finance track. I'll be your moderator today, and I will introduce the session with 6 distinguished speakers from which we will hear in a second. Before I do that, let me warmly welcome you on behalf of the C20. As you know, the C20 is the civil society engagement mechanism with the G20. It comprises of several hundreds organizations from within and beyond G20 countries across the entire globe. And it's organized in several working groups, some of which mirror the G20 process, some others actually focus on critical areas of importance for civil society. And therefore, let me also provide you a very special welcome from the International Financial Architecture Working Group of the C20, which I have the honor of co-chairing along with my good friend Osama Alemahi of the King Khaled Foundation and the C20 Secretariat. Now, before I provide the floor to the first speaker, let me do 2 things. The first one is just to clarify how the session will be run. We will have 4 different rounds. In the first round, each speaker will have the opportunity of articulating his or her critical concerns in 5 minutes. So you will have this first round of 6 interventions. Afterwards, we will have a second round in which I will pose to the speakers 1 or 2 critical questions to hear from their particular angles, their perspective. And thirdly, we will open the floor for discussion and debate on the basis of the comments and questions that you can post here in the chat. So I look forward to looking at your comments and questions, speaking and inviting the speakers to respond. And lastly, we will have then a closing series of remarks just for the speakers to have the opportunity to provide all of us with their final pitch. Secondly, let me also spend 1 minute just to introduce the topic. When we talk about the argument for development with respect to finance, and in particular the finance track, in today's conjuncture, it's interesting to refer to an editorial that has been floating around in the past weeks, where we say that in the COVID-19 pandemics, we are all in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat. And this reality of different countries, different social groups, different constituencies being on different boats in the middle of the same storm is actually at the core of the relationship between development and global finance. And this also means that very often we frame that relationship with respect to refueling the boats or providing the boats with whatever is necessary for them to go on. But we overlook the importance of the actual shape and structure and design of the boats. Not all boats are capable and designed today of navigating the storm. And this is therefore not only a matter of providing fuel, but recognizing that there are some structural transitions to enable all boats to be able to navigate the storm. And this is particularly important when we refer to the relationship between developing and so-called developed countries, when a lot of financial flows actually move from the latter, from the former to the latter, from the south to the global north. And we therefore need to configure the discussion on finance not only related to financial flows, but in terms of structural and systemic reform of global financial frameworks that actually allow for a redesign of the boats so they can actually navigate the same storm. But let me stop here. I don't want to take any time away from our panelists and go straight into the first of our interventions, in which it's a great honor to provide and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Rashid, Assistant Minister of Finance for International Affairs and Macro-Fiscal Policies of the Ministry of Finance of Saudi Arabia. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are located now. Let me begin by thanking our colleagues in the C20 group for the kind invitation and the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Saudi G20 Presidency Finance Track in this stimulating forum. Also, I would like to commend the Civil Society 20 and civil society organizations for their excellent efforts in bringing non-government and non-business voice into the G20 agenda and for their valuable contributions in defining global issues for policymakers. It has undoubtedly been a challenging year for all of us, and our colleagues, friends, and families around the world. The speed, severity, and spread in which the pandemic shocked the world and the global economy has created an unprecedented challenge that the world has not faced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. As our world strives to navigate through this global health crisis, the G20 has a key role to play in driving international cooperation to alleviate associated health, social, and economic impacts. As COVID-19 crisis began to unfold, the G20 took swift and collective action to overcoming this multifaceted challenge. The G20 Action Plan, endorsed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, sets out the key principles guiding our response and commitments to specific actions to drive forward international economic cooperation as we navigate this crisis and look ahead to a robust, sustained, and inclusive global economic recovery while enhancing resilience against future shocks, including pandemics, natural disasters, and environmental risks. On the economic front, the G20 countries have injected an unprecedented $11 trillion into the global economy, the largest support on record and over 4 times what was provided in the global financial crisis. Also, G20 worked with international financial institutions to implement a strong and swift financial response for the countries in need. In April 2020, the IMF deployed a comprehensive support package focusing on vulnerable countries, providing, as of today, more than $88 billion to 81 countries. Also, multilateral development banks have upscaled their collective commitment to approximately $230 billion for emerging and low-income countries, tailored to the health, economic, and social shocks. In addition, the G20 Historic Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, has provided the poorest countries with urgent and immediate liquidity relief, estimated to be up to $14 billion for 73 eligible countries, enabling them to strengthen their fight against the pandemic and its social and economic impacts. As part of the DSSI, private creditors have been publicly called on to participate in the initiative on comparable terms. The DSSI currently lasts until the end of 2020, and the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors will consider a possible extension to it, taking into account the development of the COVID-19 pandemic situation and the ongoing liquidity needs of eligible countries. All of this will not be enough if we do not. To date, the G20 has successfully pledged $21 billion to bridge the global health funding gap of diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, and research and development. Also, the G20 finance and health ministers met on the 17th of September and issued a joint statement that conveys a strong message on the need for a global response and the importance of taking forward our collective action to accelerate the research, development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines with the aim of supporting equitable and affordable access for all. As the policy focus turns from an emergency response, COVID-19, to the mid and longer term economic recovery phase, we will need to take advantage of opportunities in today's revolution in technology and promote a sustainable and inclusive recovery investment guided by a sense of shared long-term responsibility for our planet and citizens. We should take advantage of this crisis to tackle pre-existing global structural, social, and economic challenges. This crisis has reinforced the need to continue delivering on previously agreed G20 finance track deliverables for 2020, providing people, particularly those who are hard hit by the pandemic, with enhanced access to opportunities, promote investment in quality infrastructure, address tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy, address debt vulnerabilities for the poorest countries, and frame carefully supervisory and regulatory issues for the digital era. We would need to ensure sustained policy coordination and cooperation to avoid permanent damage and restore confidence and support investment, also promote international trade, support labor market and employment, and ensure the resilience of the international financial system. Such collective actions can be vital in promoting financing solutions to advance the sustainable development goals, focusing on the people of our United Nations, their health, and their prosperity. Let me conclude by expressing my sincere appreciation to the G20 members, relevant international organizations, and international community for the spirit of cooperation and solidarity demonstrated to date in responding to the complex global challenge presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. The G20 will continue to monitor the global health, economic, and social situations, and are determined to spare no effort to protect lives, bring the pandemic under control, safeguard people's jobs and incomes, support global economy during and after this phase, and ensure the resilience of the financial system against future shocks. I would like to conclude also by saying that finance track work has benefited a lot by the C20 group contributions in enriching the dialogue around global challenges and solutions, and we look forward to continuing that cooperation. Thank you very much, and if I pass my time, I promise you I will concede more in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rashid. You actually was precisely on time. And of course, many thanks for your important remarks. Let me therefore move on with our second speaker for this evening. We'll get back to Mr. Rashid later as we get into the dialogue section. And let me therefore introduce to you Mr. Wolfgang Schmidt, State Secretary of the Ministry of Finance of Germany. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you also for hosting the panel and for inviting me to speak here at the C20 Summit on the role of development in the G20 finance. For me, it's kind of an homecoming, and I especially felt welcome when you had this picture of the boats, because I'm from Hamburg, and I was responsible for the city-state of Hamburg for the German G20, and I was proud to host the C20 back then at the University of Hamburg. And I remember very vivid discussions and also lots of preparations with the civil society in Hamburg. So that's a privilege now to be with you and to discuss these interesting topics. For me, it's interesting to see that we are talking now about development in the G20 finance track, because when we recall what the G20 was originally all about, it was about financial crisis and banks, and it was finance ministers. Then we saw the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The leaders jumped in, and after solving these questions, other items came up, like climate change, global health, persisting poverty, sovereign debt, and so on and so on. So this then went back to the finance ministers, and now we are dealing with these issues and questions also at the finance track. So I would say that the G20 will inevitably become more than the primary forum for global economic cooperation. It's the forum that has to deal with sustainable development, because we all know all these questions require international cooperation, and at the end, most of them also require money. That is why many ministers for health, for development cooperation, for the environment, always try to seek a good relation with their finance minister at home, because we know financial resources are needed to solve these questions. My colleague Abdulaziz already mentioned many of the things that we are doing at the G20 level. I'd like to mention the G20 Action Plan from 2016 that linked the finance or the G20 work with the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, now the COVID crisis brought a lot of new challenges to all of us. We face this crisis as one mankind, but we also know that it affects poor countries much more severe than those in the north. If you look at what we did, nearly every finance ministry, nearly every head of state or government, we try to deal with the health crisis at home. We try to deal with the impact on the economy. But I would argue that fortunately enough, this time we didn't limit ourselves to our nation states and to find solutions only for us. But we immediately discussed the questions in the G20 context, also in the financial track. We came up with the G20 Action Plan under the Saudi presidency. IMF and World Bank initiated together with the G20 the already mentioned debt service suspension initiative, and many, many more things. And this is, I think, important that we remember that this world is so interconnected that we can't do it alone, and that there is a responsibility. And I see that in the G20. We will probably discuss whether the G20 is the right and legitimate forum. As somebody who used to work also in the NGO sector, I can tell you that I think that G20 is actually working because you have the relevant players together and in a manageable size so that they actually meet and don't only send their deputies. So maybe the last words on what I think is also important when it comes to sustainable development. This is the question of tax justice, because one question is debt relief, debt suspension, financial aid. But what we need, especially for the countries in the south, is that they have their own base, own domestic revenues, and that requires fair and effective taxation. That is one of our priorities in the G20 context. We tasked the OECD to come up with a proposal for a fairer redistribution of taxation rights, especially for the digital economy, and for global minimum taxation so that we avoid having tax havens where multinational companies can just escape. The last word, one thing that we also from Germany push very much is the question of remittances. And there is always, we have to keep a balance between bringing down the cost so that migrants in developed countries can send back money to their families and to be invested in the economies, and the anti-money laundering laws, fighting illicit financial flows, and something that we all also want, that money from developing countries is not poured into bank accounts in offshore havens or developed countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your remarks and for making reference to the experience of the G20 and Civil 20 in Germany, which has been certainly very, very important for us and helped framing in many ways the Civil 20 and the way in which it is currently structured. So I think it is extremely important for me also to make reference to that. Now, if we will again go back to Mr. Schmidt as we go back to the dialogue, let me continue with our sequence of intervention. We were supposed to have now the Finance Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, but we're having some technical difficulties in connecting him. So I would ask Mr. Navid Hanif, also a good friend, Director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office of UNDESA, to go ahead with his intervention. Navid, please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm delighted, honored to join such a distinguished panel.
What happened?
The theme that you have chosen, Stefano, and C20 particularly, the argument for development and finance.
It might be better if you move to Vimeo,
it
because
really
I think
has defined my professional life at the UN. And if I were to put it in one word, I would say it's inseparable. You just cannot separate development and finance. One decision which really reinforces my description is the decision by the Nobel Committee in 2019, when they decided to give the award to economic sciences to Paul Romer and William Nordhaus, the least expected Nobel Prize that was given people working in very different fields. Romer and Nordhaus have largely been active in different fields. Romer is a leading thinking on the factors that drive economic growth, notably innovation, and Nordhaus is a pioneering voice in the economic field on issues of climate change. So the committee acknowledged long-run economic growth and sustainable development are inseparable. Host has remused me for the meeting, so I was surprised. So this is the economic evidence or argument to support your assertion. Then we have the political agreements, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, Monterey Consensus, and of course the Doha Declaration. The empirical argument is even stronger. For example, we know that the physical transition and liability risks posed by climate change can become a systemic risk to financial stability. It is also well documented that inequality hurts growth. So we have the political, intellectual, and economic arguments behind this strong link between financial decisions and sustainable development. What is new? The new is the urgency to heed the evidence and take real action. And we commend the Saudi presidency and the members of G20. They are doing their best, but the challenges are really acute, urgent, and global. As you very well described, we are in the same storm, but different boats. So let me highlight 4 areas where the development perspective should drive finance decisions in the G20. First, we must advance discussions on how to give countries much needed breathing space to respond to the crisis, while enhancing the ability to achieve sustainable development. The UN Secretary General has stressed debt relief should not be based on level of income, but on vulnerability. And the UN has put forward initiatives to free resources for SDG investments. I won't list those. Those are available in the UN policy briefs because we are short of time. Second, and the State Secretary mentioned, tax avoidance and evasion diminish national revenues, eroding countries' ability to provide basic services, and they undermine global efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda. Effective resource mobilization and redistribution depend not only on national policies and regulations, but also on appropriate tax norms that can unlock the potential of tax administration. And systems in all countries. A large number of lower-income countries do not participate in the international forums where global tax norms are set. We think the G20 can serve as a vanguard for putting sustainable development at the center of global tax norms. And by responding to the call of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which says universal in approach and scope and should fully take into account the different needs and capacities of all countries. That's how international tax cooperation should be framed. My third point is building forward better from the crisis and achieve a sustainable post-COVID economy. As we face the health emergency, the climate crisis is already around the corner. Actually, I think it's right here. We simply cannot continue to sleepwalk from crisis to crisis. My fourth point is G20 must put a renewed focus on combating inequality through inclusive economic policies and readjustments to the global growth paradigm. Let me repeat, it's said repeatedly, we're only as strong as our weakest link. That is not only true for health challenges, but also economic and social challenges. The integration of the 2030 Agenda as a principal framework for the discussion on the finance track can also serve as a vital entry point for broadening the conversation and bring in the voices of a wider range of countries and stakeholders, particularly civil society. I would like to take this opportunity to commend civil society for raising the bar in these discussions and the discussions led by the Secretary General, Jamaica and Canada, and putting bold proposals on the table. And let's not forget that rather than an end in itself, financing is a means to an end. And I'm sure we'll all agree that the end in the realization of the G20's mandate to achieve strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hanif. And let me also use the opportunity in my capacity as coordinator of the Civil Society FFD group to commend the very intense and close partnership that we enjoy with the Office for Financing for Sustainable Development that you lead. And it's really a pleasure to have you here, but it's also a pleasure to work with you and all your collaborators throughout the year. So thank you so much, and we'll come back to you as the debate moves on to the dialogue session. So let me then continue with our list of speakers and their different angles to our conversation. We're still trying to connect the Finance Secretary of Bangladesh. So let me move on to Mrs. Alice Albright, the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Partnership for Education. Mrs. Albright, the floor is yours for your initial intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Let me just do a quick check that everybody can hear me. Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Yes, well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to have been invited by the C20 to talk about the sort of interplay between development and finance issues. And I can very heartily agree with the two speakers that have preceded me that I believe that these two issues are absolutely intertwined. I'm going to build, Stefano, on your boat and storm analogy and take a few minutes to tell you what's happening in the education boat, because it is indeed facing a significant storm. So the pandemic created the largest disruption of education systems in history, impacting 94% of the world's student population. The impact of the learning crisis, plus disruption, plus inequalities, is that some 24 million children and youth may drop out and never ever set foot in a school again. COVID's impact on human development is significant. First, regarding gender equality, when not in school, girls face the additional risks of child marriage, pregnancy, and so 20 million more girls may never go back to school. Second, the economic impact. The impact of COVID-19 school closures on lifetime earnings for today's enrolled students in low-income countries amounts to an estimated loss of 13% of GDP. Third impact, of course, is global poverty. Those living in poverty may increase by as much as 500 million people, or 8% of the total human population, increasing, and this is very worth the G20 noting, increasing for the first time since 1990. Many governments have reacted quite swiftly. Developing country partners, our partners, have mobilized fast to mitigate the immediate impacts of school closures. They have launched and delivered remote learning initiatives on an unprecedented scale through radio, television, teacher training, and with offline learning materials. In fact, my organization, GPE, mobilized our fastest and largest ever emergency response, totaling over $500 million to help prevent the loss of learning and potential in over 50 countries. Indeed, the G20 delayed debt servicing on bilateral loans for IDA-eligible countries, and the IMF has offset repayment costs for 25 vulnerable economies until December 2020. These are all positive steps. We at GPE are particularly concerned about the impact that the pandemic will have on education financing. The latest projections are the pandemic will cause a global economic contraction of 3%. This will affect public sector and education spending in most developing countries. As budgets are impacted by the coming recession, many governments may have to borrow even further. Yet debt repayments are being deferred, but not reduced. And this deferral, plus the compounding of interest that will come along with it, could lead very well to increased debt burden over time. What does this mean for education? This means that every dollar spent on debt servicing is one less dollar spent on learning. What should the G20 do? In the face of the coming recession, G20 finance ministers have already shown leadership. However, now is the time to continue to take bold action and finance what I will call building back better. I'd like to take this opportunity to make 3 recommendations to the G20 finance leaders. First is to invest in rebuilding education and building the human capital that is urgently needed to help fuel future growth and recovery. Second, lean into relieving, postponing, and restructuring debt for low and lower middle income countries to create the fiscal space that they so badly need so that they can finance their own social expenditures, health and education, and many others. Third, look at aid budgets and sustain aid budgets. It would be very tempting right now to cut aid budgets. Now is the last time to cut aid budgets. Aid budgets should be protected and, in fact, even increased. The key opportunity to do this is at GPE's financing conference, which will be next summer. There, G20 leaders will have an opportunity to step up and fund education systems so that they can be transformed to deliver the skills necessary for the 21st century. A few specific points. Germany is a pivotal partner of GPE on gender equality and on girls' education. We welcome Germany's support to education, and we encourage Germany to continue to take a significant global leadership role by supporting GPE with a pledge of 110 million euros. To Saudi Arabia, I've always been impressed by how forward-looking the Middle East is on education. Since 2011, our partners, the United Arab Emirates, have donated over $1.5 billion to support education globally. This is remarkable leadership in the region. Saudi Arabia has also prioritized education through its leading role in the Islamic Development Bank, the King Salman Center, and the Saudi Fund for Development. We applaud this leadership. But there is room for all to do more, and I would encourage Saudi Arabia as a regional and global power to bolster its commitment to education and prioritize innovative financing tools as a catalyst to support peaceful and prosperous societies. I look forward to the remainder of the conversation and continue to share ideas about some of the structural issues between development and between finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your intervention and your very remarkable points. I think we'll come back to you for the next round on looking more at the more structural reform issues. But in the meantime, let me then give the floor for the moment to our next panelist, Mrs. Susana Ruiz, a global lead on tax justice for Oxfam International. And in the meantime, Susana, prior to letting you start, let me say that we are still trying to resolve the connection problems with the Finance Secretary of Bangladesh. We hope we'll manage, and wherever we are in the program, as soon as he's able to join us, I think I will give him the floor so he has the opportunity to complement the prior intervention. But in the meantime, Susana, over to you. Susana is also a very active member of our C20 International Finance Architecture Working Group, so I'm sure she'll pick on many of our key recommendations. Susana, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you very much for the invitation to be in this distinguished panel, and for Oxfam to contribute in such a crucial moment for, especially for developing countries. So let's be clear. I mean, while this coronavirus continues to ravage the world, the scale and the impact on poverty and inequality is reaching unexpected levels. But this crisis is already exacerbating the weakness of the past. And that makes it very explicit that developing countries' capacity to react to this pandemic has been and will be very related to their fiscal space, as Alice was also mentioning, their capacity to access to international and national additional funding at a reasonable cost, and their ability to mitigate the collapse in tax revenue without adding the burden on those who are the most vulnerable and average citizens. So are we getting there? Well, domestic resources are simply shrinking, and fiscal crisis will accelerate in almost every developing country. Oxfam has estimated, for example, for the Latin American region, that the entire region will lose close to the equivalent to 59% of central government budgets in health. Imagine the scale and the level of the crisis for those countries. That can mean for some countries up to a third of the current revenue. But if resources are scarce, not everyone has been hit the same, and the G20 therefore needs to contribute in making the right choices and the right recommendations this time. There is no time to waste. Well, at least in the current crisis, the G20 seems to have taken a strong stance on poor countries' need. It took only 1 month since the pandemic was declared for the G20 to create a debt suspension initiative. It's a limited initiative that needs to be strengthened fast to ensure countries are not paying off the money they don't have. We need debt relief to be immediate, especially by private sector and multilateral development banks. These low-income developing countries have already paid 22 billion to the richest countries. Steep reform to the financial architecture of debt should be jump-started soon enough. And the IMF, as what's already been mentioned, released its own proposal on the matter last week. But we all know that long-term sustainable financing lies, as Mr. Wolfgang Schmidt was well saying, on money. And that means two things. On one side, a wise, responsible, and effective use of the debt resources, but also more than ever on taxes. And here, delaying reform is a poor excuse. This pandemic is not just creating new tax problems, it is expanding, amplifying, and exposing all the unresolved problems of the past. The time is now, and the G20 need to respond to the challenge of tax reform, as well as go beyond the current and very limited debt relief efforts with only 5 billion of postponed payment that will not go far as revenues retreat and private creditors and the World Bank smile and collect the money. But is the G20 delivering the tax? Well, in response to the previous global financial crisis, when the G20 was actually reinventing itself, leaders identified the need to act on the mismatches, on the unfairness, and on the loopholes of the international corporate tax system. The language was really very strong at that time. And because at that time, when countries were starting with their budget deficit, media scandals were showing, as absurd as it was, that some of the largest and most profitable companies were operating worldwide without paying their fair share. Actually, it's not so far from what we are seeing currently still. In any case, it took, however, to the G20 almost 4 years to have a plan, what was called the BEPS, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Plan, that needed a second plan, the BEPS 2.0. And here we are, 7 years later, and it seems we need a BEPS 0.3 because even if the G20 has been doing progress, which will still be very likely failing in delivering the bold reform of the international tax system that developing countries need. Can we afford not delivering? The solutions have been on the table for the G20, and in that way, it was a success, even that the G20 St. Petersburg communique was making even a stronger declaration on the need and the mandate to deliver this tax reform also for developing countries. Now this process, led by the OECD and with 137 countries around the table, is far from being on real and equal terms. As long as countries, especially rich and powerful countries, are coming to the table to prioritize their national interests or protect their industry, the international community and the G20 will fail. And it's just not acceptable when we see that some of those companies, especially the very digitalized ones, are doing even super profit during this pandemic. The economy is intensifying the digitalization, but the tax system, even under the efforts of the G20, are lagging behind. So we urge the G20 to be part of that movement, to build the momentum that will lead to those reforms. Now, we cannot handcuff ourselves to business as usual. If another decade of pain is to be averted, governments need to take immediate actions to reduce inequalities through providing public services to protect ordinary people by taxing the richest, by taxing the most profitable companies, and by guaranteeing aid support and a debt bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susana. Clear and effective as usual. Thank you for your contribution, and we'll soon come back to you. I also let me mention before moving to the next speaker that there's an interesting series of elements which are connecting here. I mean, I've heard very clearly, from one of the speakers about the urgency of really reforming, rethinking the allocation of taxing rights rules. I've heard from another speaker the need to do it with full participation on equal terms by developing countries, which are the ones that currently suffer the current regime. And we heard very clearly by another speaker that the attempts we've made until now, going into a cyclical, evolution, but they don't manage to resolve the matter. So there seems to be, a momentum here for breaking the cycle. The problem is clear. We just need to take the courage to do what's necessary to enter into a different form of international tax cooperation. But let me now move to the next speaker. I think we have managed to resolve the technical issue, and it's a great honor for me to give the floor to Mr. Abdur Rauf Talukder. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Finance Secretary of the Ministry of Finance Bangladesh, but here also representing the group of Vulnerable 20. The floor is yours.
I'm extremely sorry for not being connected. However, let me read out my statement. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude and profound regards to the organizer for inviting me at the C20 Summit panel discussion. As you all know, that geographically, Bangladesh is located at a very vulnerable position. Flood, cyclone, and climate change impacted heavily on our overall development agenda. We have longer-term perspective plan, 5-year plan, and annual development program, which have been designed to achieve SDGs and our own development goals to become higher middle income country by 2030. Bangladesh is on track to be graduated from LDC to become a developing country by 2021, fulfilling all 3 preconditions set by United Nations. We achieved over 7% GDP growth in last 5 years. Per capita GNI rose from $843 in 2010 to $2,064 in 2019. Literacy rate increased from 15% to 75% during the same period. Life expectancy at birth also increased to 72.6 years from 67 years. Fiscal deficit remains around 5% of GDP, and our debt to GDP ratio is one of the lowest among the developing countries. Everything went well until February 2020, before COVID-19 hit Bangladesh, for which the country went into 66 days long lockdown. Eventually, we had to compromise between life and livelihood, and government had no other option but to open up the economic activities gradually. We had to address 2 issues simultaneously. Firstly, the health-related activities for which we were not ready at all. However, government is bearing all costs for treatment of COVID-affected patients. Secondly, bring back the economy to the post-COVID state. The government has initiated 4-fold policy intervention to overcome the COVID fallout. Those are increase public expenditure, introduce fiscal incentives, expand social safety net programs, and increase money supply. Despite revenue shortfall, the government announced number of stimulus packages equivalent to 4.03% of GDP, which were a combination of fiscal and monetary policy actions. Due to timely and appropriate actions taken by the government, the economy has bounced back and we are now observing the sign of early recovery. We strongly believe that the global pandemic has offered a great opportunity to build back better by enhanced development cooperation, promoting regional and multilateral partnerships, engaging all actors, including the private sector, international community, and civil society organizations. LDCs should be given their previously committed market access and allowed to continue international support measures beyond graduation for a certain period. For example, Bangladesh will lose its preferential market access after 2024 because of the developing country status, but we need current market access to be continued till 2030. That will basically help us to achieve sustainable development goals and targets. LDCs are developing countries should be given increased support to minimize the digital divide as ICT and other frontier technologies proved effective in the pandemic. We believe that a vaccine will be key to restore full economic activity. The global community must assure affordable and adequate vaccines for LDCs and developing nations. Many LDCs and developing nations are disproportionately affected by climate change for which they are hardly contributors. Immediate and urgent attention should be given to build back better and reduce vulnerability against potential threats from similar pandemic or crisis in future. The G20 finance track needs to play an effective role in engaging a consistent flow of adequate funds from developed countries and development partners to developing and LDCs so that they can meet their development needs and challenges, especially in relation to achieving sustainable development goals. I want to stop here for now. Thank you very much for patient sharing.
So I was thinking about the need for systemic reform, and I think it's clear, has been articulated by many speakers, but it's also important to recognize that those systemic reforms require a democratic process, require full and equal participation of all countries, including developing ones, who very often are at the lower end of that decision making. So how can the G20 relate better with the United Nations process centered on the 2030 agenda and the financing for sustainable development agenda? What is that relationship? How can we actually explore this systemic reform in a manner which is democratically accessible to all countries? So let me go with the same order of the speakers. So Mr. Albright, I think I will invite you to contribute first. Floor is yours.
Mr. Schmidt talked about the original idea behind the G20 finance track, which was the initial creation of the G20. I think that having a more resilient financial system globally is not an end of itself. It has to be linked to serving the real economy and serving in general the development goals. And this is the challenge, to work in financial reforms, anchoring those reforms to deliver on real outcomes in the development agenda. And I believe that most of what has happened during the last years is just adding more maybe resilience to the financial system. The other part, which is linking that resilience to be serving the development goals, is what we are missing now. And I believe that the disconnection between the real economy and the financial sector is becoming more prominent as we move forward. And I believe that this is something that what we, during the pandemic, during the Saudi presidency, we're trying to do is to use the system during the crisis as it is and to get the most of it to benefit developing countries and also others. But the point is that this agenda, this overall reform, is a very long-term agenda. And I definitely support your proposition. And I think that this needs to be looked into not only through minor changes to the architecture, but I believe maybe we need a point of a new Bretton Woods sometime in the future. Because I think that the current financial architecture maybe have, in a way, expired in a way that it's not capable now to serve the needs of the time. And I believe that this needs to be definitely looked at. And we all know that there was an effort within the G20 in the previous years to look into that reform, but it's always the short-term pressing issues that are taking most of the time during the discussions, and not the long-term structural issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rashid. I'm sure you know very well that this is music to our ears, no? Civil society has really been pushing for going beyond our current frameworks and really reforming our architecture. But, you know, there's a famous economist called Mr. Keynes that says that in the long term, we shall all be dead. So at some point, we need to make that long term our present. So, Mr. Schmidt, is that our present? You know, you've been referring also already to some systemic reforms. You call for a need to rethink taxing rights rules. So what kind of structural reforms and how to do them in a democratic manner? Over to you.
I'd like to pour some water in the wine, because I have a general feeling that despite having been part in the structural reform debates for now also nearly 30 years or something like that, I think we are at the moment in a completely different time. And at the moment, we have to defend the pure idea of multilateral cooperation and not falling back to national ideas and to building blocks and returning to power games. So my feeling, and having been on the official side of this business only for 3 years now, that rather than thinking about progress and new ideas and new structures, I have a feeling that we are in a situation that we have to defend those that already exist. And obviously you could, and I mentioned that earlier, you could start talking about the flaws and weaknesses of G20 and the question whether it is representative for the world as is. But we also have to take into consideration that it is a club of countries that cooperate on a voluntary basis, and we always need consensus. And other speakers mentioned the difficulties also on the DSSI or on the tax question. And I can tell you, these are painful discussions. And very often a consensus is far away. And you as civil society, you observe the communiques and you read between the lines, and you know when there is a compromise that is just covered or covering the differences that we had. And if you look not at the finance track, but at the leaders track, for some years, it's not a G20 on several items. It's a G19 plus one. And so rather than thinking, okay, what is there and what can be improved, I think we should also be pragmatic and realistic. That is now the governmental bureaucrat here. And look at what we have and where we can, even in little steps, improve. And therefore, my assessment, for example, on the DSSI is much more positive, because it is the first time that we have all also new creditors participating. And we all know the old world where the Paris Club and the rich countries are the main creditors. This is over. We have new actors, and we've had lots of problems in integrating them in the system and making them participate. And not to speak of the private creditors, where, for example, we as the German Ministry of Finance are pushing very hard that they need to be included in the second edition of the DSSI. So these are things that I think would be worthwhile discussing. Otherwise, we have a beautiful discussion about the perfect world it should be, but I think in my lifetime, I won't see it happen.
Thank you so much for what I can call a reality check on the complexity of the current conjuncture, also in political terms. And this seems to me a perfect pass to our colleague Navid Hanif, because that's precisely a little bit the context in which he is currently and continuously located. So from your angle, how do you connect this conversation in between the short term and there's the more systemic structural reforms? Over to you.
Stefano, you have asked a big question. And I think the previous two speakers addressed from both dimensions, what the way it should be and what's possible. My own experience, I was a student of economics, starts in 1997 with the Asian financial crisis. And G20 is a product of that crisis. At the ministerial level, summit became in 2008. The G20 has done whatever is feasible, viable, political. But let me mention, and this I said in my statement, if we continue to live from crisis to crisis, the challenges will become acute and sometimes unmanageable also. And this kind of crisis that we are living through is very different from 97, 2008. Crisis in the health emergency is turning the world upside down. And I want to mention, what is it that we are struggling and grappling with? And I think Abdulaziz and Mr. Schmidt mentioned, there are certain flaws and gaps which we have always mentioned that the system had from the very beginning, because it wasn't conceived as one organic whole. The second challenge, which our colleague from the civil society mentioned, we have new things. We are still trying to address the old gaps, and we have new challenges that we have to grapple with. BEPS is one example. I see many areas. Debt. Let me be very specific. What systemic shift is needed? The United Nations has been calling since the Monterey Consensus, the global debt architecture has to be fixed. But before we could pursue that, look at the new picture. Paris Club, non-Paris Club members, and the private sector. The debt picture has changed significantly since 2008 and 9. This architecture needs to be really rethought. And I'm glad we have seen some movement coming out of the head of IMF. She has acknowledged the debt architecture has to be fixed. And that is a UN call for decades. Let's move to the area of taxation. And you are very familiar with that issue, Stefan. The challenge we are facing, digital economy, taxation of digital economy, was not on the table even 15 years ago. So we have to struggle and deal with this new challenge while we have old problems where we are still trying to find a solution which is workable for everyone. So what we have seen, solutions work if there is ownership, and Mr. Schmidt is absolutely right. Multilateralism has to be strengthened. Multilateralism, which is inclusive, gives equity, equality, and takes care of all concerns in a fair manner. That's the way to advance solutions in solving problems which predate the crisis and problems which we are facing right now. And one I want to mention, debt is headline, but let's not forget liquidity is a challenge. Countries do not have liquidity to look at the social protection challenges, job creation. So the systemic risks are becoming acute. We need practical, pragmatic solutions. G20 has addressed some aspects. but more certainly can be done by the G20, and of course, through an inclusive multilateral platform like the UN, where we can hear all voices. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much for your contribution. And let me, considering that time is tight, let me run, therefore, to our next speaker. Alice Albright, you already were hinting at some of the sort of structural systemic reform. So over to you now, and then we'll move to Susana. And just to alert everyone, we will not be able to hear directly from Mr. Talukder here. He will be recording a message and we will share it to all the participants. So at least even in a suboptimal way, we'll still be able to enjoy his perspective. Mrs. Albright, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just very quickly, I think what we've seen in the past 6 to 8 months is how vulnerable the world is. And from the world that we're in, education, it is incredibly vulnerable. In a matter of a couple of weeks, 1.6 billion children were put out of school, and many of them will not return, and they will not have the future that they hoped for. And in many ways, the future that will come out of it will be one that has much deeper inequities than we expected, and it will become a world of haves and have-nots. And much of the progress that we've seen on the SDG agenda and possibly the MDG agenda may get rolled back. So I think now is the time to urgently look at how, in particular, human capital is financed. And we're seeing, I would argue, that the system that we have now is not fit for purpose. So what I would suggest some ways to begin to think about changes. And I know this is all terribly complex. But I would start looking at the country level, and I would look at how international aid comes into the country level, and I would look at how it dovetails with domestic financing. And what I see is a very fragmented picture where, and I'm making generalizations, much of what is financed is done on a project basis rather than enhancing countries' own decisions on their own priorities. And so I would encourage people to move from a project-based world to a country-driven, country priority-based world, and use and strengthen country systems to help countries make the decisions that they want to make and get the financing from various sources that they can to enable those priorities to become a reality. Many people on the panel have talked already about the fiscal space. There are issues to do with debt there, about taxation. Clearly, those issues have to be solved. We would be very in favor of looking very deeply at both of them because both of them are, in different respects, taking away the necessary fiscal space that countries need to invest in social services, health, education, nutrition going forward. Third point is around innovation. What we have seen in education, this is perhaps a touch of a silver lining of COVID, is that there are some new interesting ways of delivering education, particularly distance education, radio and TV, that are enabling education systems to reach further. That is not in a way to displace teachers, but it's a way of addressing possibly some of the reach issues that have been present in education, frankly, going back to the MDG era. So we need to look at the incentives around innovation, whether it's financial, whether it's delivery, and encourage innovation, proper, suitable innovation. And finally, I'm going to end with a point on vulnerability. The development world, with some exceptions, but in general, does not really think about how to prepare itself for vulnerability. And there are tools out there for doing so. The disaster risk insurance world is one of them, but we've just seen a major dislocation in the delivery of education that came about in a very quick period of time. And we seem to be continuing to go from crisis to crisis without standing back and saying, how can we invent the financial tools to enable us to respond to crises on a predictable basis so that we don't get set back periodically? So I do think that there is some serious work to be done about how the fit of financial tools can actually match the needs and the challenges that we see, particularly around the human capital agenda and particularly around education. So those are my thoughts, and happy to continue talking about those at some further point.
Thank you so much, Alice. And Let me then go to the final speaker for this round. Susana, floor is over to you.
Stefano, let me say that, from civil society side, we've been participating and attending most of the debates around the development and financing for development for a long time. And I remember the times when just having a sentence on the communique regarding taxation was already seen as a success, and we have been encouraged by some of the steps that have been taken. But they are baby steps, and we cannot just accept that. And especially, we were probably very tough in some of the comments we've been doing in the past, but it's just that it's not acceptable in this moment and the context we have. And we need more than just cooperation. We need action. And that is probably something that needs to build a different fiscal pact for a new and social contract that can be adjusted to the reality. But we cannot just accept that this is difficult to build consensus. We know that. It's just that the context is too difficult to accept that the consensus is requires for countries to make concessions and not to put their interest and their industries on top of everything when the discussion is going on the table. So we need a structural pact that is taking into account all that. And yes, it is very much about corporate taxation, because corporations are operating worldwide, because that is putting and shifting the burden of equality in the current system and break the barriers to more fairly tax capital and wealth in a more systemic way. This should be a new agenda for the G20. And I know it's a bit difficult to be talking about what has not been delivered, and again, adding a new element on the agenda, but it's the reality. Not everyone has been hit in harmed the same with this pandemic. We were looking at the Middle East and Northern Africa region in another research that we were releasing some weeks ago, and the 21 top billionaires in the region, all the men. So their wealth increased by nearly 10 billion since the start of the pandemic. So within the pandemic, there is a small elite that is making even more super profits and is becoming richer than before. They almost doubled the wealth that they were creating during this time, was almost doubling the money that it was required to rebuild Lebanon's shattered capital after the events in the summer. So for too long, the G20 has been prioritizing profit and growth at the expense of the public good and safety. The result is that we cannot just wait until that. We need an agenda that is putting taxing corporations, but also wealth and capital as central to the reforms. And just to say that austerity is not a plan B. We've been hearing also very encouraging words this time that we will not be waiting, that countries need to spend at this moment, and that's the priority. But at the same time, we're seeing very warming language about some of the conditionalities and the request from the international financial institution also. Austerity is not the plan B. Oxfam is part of a movement, big movement from the civil society with more than 500 organizations that is saying that this cannot be the next step. And this should be also a consensus built at the G20. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana, and thanks so much to all speakers. Now, we are approaching the end of the session. There were some comments by some of the participants, but I have the feeling that we need to move to the concluding round. And therefore, I will invite the speakers in the same order to provide their final pitch. And I would suggest that we look back at the overall theme of the session, the argument for development in the finance track. And when we do that, and sorry to provide a stimulus just before you taking the floor, we very often think that it's finance that needs to sort of help development somehow. But in many ways, finance is not always a good guy. We know very well that many of the dynamics of exclusion, of marginalization, in many ways of undermining of state capabilities also come from the recent development in global finance. So can development help redeem global finance? Can we also look at it the other way in many respects? Is this really a bilateral dialogue that requires a new order to emerge? You know, referring to the wise word of Mr. Rashid in his previous intervention. So your final pitch on the overall argument. Mr. Rashid, the floor is yours to start with.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And I believe, as a concluding remark, I believe that I'd like to just, comment on some of the ideas that I've already heard with regard to taxation. I assure you that during our presidency this year, we spared no effort to try to reach consensus with regard to the international tax infrastructure architecture. And as you all know, there was a lot of progress in the technical side within the OECD. However, there is still a missing piece, which is the political will of all members. And I believe that definitely this is a priority to the G20. And I believe that, at the end of this year, or maybe during the Italian presidency next year, we all hope that this will continue, and it includes both Pillar 1 and 2, one on the digitalization of the economy, the tax on digital economy, and the minimum tax pillar, which is Pillar 2. So this is an important issue, and I believe it will have a dramatic change on developing countries when it comes to fiscal space and providing finance for their development. Another also issue that I'd like to talk about is that the DSI, as good as it is, it's not enough, that's for sure. And the work has been designed that there will be a phase 2 in which those countries that have benefited from the DSSI will not be in a way stressed after the suspension, and there has to be a work with international organizations, with creditors, to make sure that the long-term solution for their debt is sound and to the benefit of their development efforts. And definitely, just to conclude, I believe that talking about the G20 and how it is more effective during crisis and less effective when there isn't a crisis. And I believe this is a very, very fundamental point, that momentum within the G20 has to be continued, especially looking into at the architecture, the international financial architecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rashid. And I can tell you on behalf, this time with a different hat, which is the hat of the organizing committee of the Italian Civil 20, that we really look forward to continuing this conversation with you, not only in the remainder of this year, but also as we work through the Italian presidency next year. And with this, let me thank you once again, and let me move to Mr. Schmidt. Over to you for your final pitch.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think that if we look back at the beginning of G20, both at the finance ministers level and the leaders level, we've come a long way. And I think that including sustainable development in the work, both of the finance track, but also obviously on the leaders track, is something that happened, and this will not go away. And also, if you take a look at the IMF, the World Bank, and how these institutions transformed and what kind of role they are playing today compared to where they were 30 years ago, it's a rather positive assessment, I think. And every politician all over the world needs to mention at least the SDGs and needs to talk about sustainable development goals and sustainable development. And this is also thanks to the people that are represented in the audience, in the virtual audience. This is the civil society. And that is why I think it is important that the C20 is an integral part of the G20 process. And that is why I very much welcome that our Saudi Arabian friends and obviously the Italian colleagues and all the others take the torch and continue to cooperate with the civil society. I know we are on different sides. We as the governments, we have to deal with these compromises and sometimes with outcomes that are not satisfactory for you. But to have this exchange and to discuss these items, I think, is of utmost importance. So I'm rather optimistic. And I think it's good that we have this exchange, and I'd like to thank you for organizing this and having us on this panel.
And thanks you for closing on with some words of optimism that we very much need these days, considering the conjuncture, and that's very appreciated. And I will want to renew, exactly as I did before, the same message on behalf of the Italian Civil 20, looking forward to a very close cooperation as we move through the final part of the Saudi presidency and into the Italian presidency. So looking forward to this channel remaining open with you as we move forward. And I can say exactly the same thing even before he speaks to Mr. Hanif, because we're really looking forward at a very closer relationship with the FFV process as we move forward. But as we do that, please, your final pitch, Mr. Hanif.
Stefano, thank you for your reassuring statement. I also want to assure you we want very close relationship with you and take it from strength to strength. Let me pick up from your very thoughtful question, can development help finance? And we have to give full credit to the civil society. Let's go back to 2015. You were the ones who had advocated very strongly it should be a universal agenda. So there is a notion of development before 2015 in globally agreed documents where North is helping South to get out of poverty, improve health conditions. 2015 agenda defines development as development of societies in every country. The way they consume, produce, interact with the planet, and deal with their own poor and vulnerable people. So after the 2030 agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, every dollar the way it is earned, saved, spent, invested, defines a development of a society and the development of this planet. It should be fit for our existence as a habitat. If 2030 agenda is not embraced as the defining framework for building forward, I don't want to use building back better. I don't want to go to the ways of the past. It will be very unfortunate if we do not change our trajectory after this crisis. So if we want to build forward with a vision for humanity which is meant to lift everyone out of poverty and leave no one behind and save our planet, that is the development vision captured in the 2030 agenda. And that's what the UN stands for, but agreed by all 193 member states and strongly supported by the civil society. So Stefano, thank you for the opportunity to join you and all the panelists. I just want to end my intervention that this is the time to change our trajectory in the way we invest, spend, earn, and save. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hanif. Extremely clear, and you know very well that we are absolutely on this, in total sync with this need to look at multilateral frameworks as the defining paradigm for the way forward. And And with this, let me turn to Mrs. Albright. Over to you for your final pitch.
Thank you very much. You've asked a very important question, which is sort of the interplay between development and finance. And I would argue that they're vital partners. When I think about, then the further question, what can development do for finance? Think about investing in human capital and what the benefits of that are. If we invest in human capital, we'll see, I would argue that the return on investment of investing in human capital is significant. We'll see productivity gains, we'll see gains in earnings, we'll see increases in demand for products globally. If we invest in girls, their children will be healthier, their children will be able to be better prepared for their future. Children want to have their future to be a positive one, and they would like to go to school. If we invest in human capital, the likelihood that we'll have solutions to all of the world's great challenges right now, I'm thinking of climate, I'm thinking of energy solutions, the chances of having those solutions goes up. If we look at the disparities in population growth between some of the developing countries and the developed countries, we can see that the demand in the future is going to come from the developing countries. So I think it is in the interest of the globe to invest in the human capital of the South. And that is what development can do to help finance, is show a positive return on investment. And I believe there's significant demand in the South to have that return on investment be very positive. So I would like to close by just saying that I think that the partnership between development and finance is in fact a partnership. And what the development side of the equation would like to do is be invested in so that it can show that very positive return in all the different dimensions that I mentioned. Thanks so much for including me. We love working with civil society. We also have a growing discussion with finance ministers, and we'd like to keep in touch with both. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your very powerful word, Mrs. Albright. And with this, just the final intervention, which of course has to come from civil society. So over to Susana Ruiz to hear our last pitch for the session. Susana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. So let me say that more than thinking what development can do to help finance, what we need is another model of finance. We need a human economy that works really, putting at the center those who are the most vulnerable, putting at the center women and girls, and an economy that cannot accept those disparities, this paradox of economy that cannot just justify that while so many close to 500 million people can be falling in poverty this year, we can have a small number of billionaires that can be increasing their wealth during the pandemic. We cannot accept that an economy that is seen at this moment, so how many small and medium-sized companies are closing or will be really struggling to keep employment, will be, or to survive, will live at the same time as some super large companies doing pandemic profits, extraordinary profit during this time. It's not just a small level of inequality, it's a structural level, and this paradox is creating a huge level of discontent that can put at risk also the recovery. So I think the G20 need to prioritize domestic revenue mobilization because this is the cornerstone to finance the SDG. We need really rich countries to put massively scale up their help, led by the G20. We need to be bold on aid, and Alice was very clear also at the beginning. We need, and I will happy to hear that we need to expand also the DSSI system, and that I don't know if it's a phase 2, but we need to make it to make sure that it's designed to be more inclusive and actionable initiative, and without any confusion, we need a system that is a tax system that is not dominated by the interests of rich countries, that is not accepting that so many profits are shifted to tax haven, that is not exacerbating tax competition, and is not putting the burden of taxation on families, on workers, and on consumption. It's a time to tax capital because we need another capital system. We need to deliver for those who need it more. And that's the responsibility of the G20 to build that consensus, to build this new order. So we'll be joining forces with the G20, with the UN, because there is a leadership role to be played by the UN in all this process. And we hope that soon we'll see something that is delivering a better order for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana. And let me thank all the speakers as well as all the participants on the audience for this session. I have no closing remarks to make. Only one notion. Let's not use the long term as a comfort zone for something where we can kick what we need to do today. Today is the moment in which people are struggling, are suffering, and this is the moment in which we need to show leadership and promote the changes that we all know are necessary. Let's not use the long term as a comfort zones to avoid taking decisions today. Thank you so much, and please continue to follow the C20 Summit sessions throughout the entire week. And there's no clapping in these virtual meetings, but let me really all raise our hands for the wonderful panel today, and looking forward to the continuation of this conversation in other sessions and in the continuation of the G20 and Civil 20 process. Thank you so much, and have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're located. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Take care. Thank you.